Welcome to the Behind the Goals podcast, the podcast about fans, for fans and by fans. Please welcome your hosts, Andrew Jenkin and Alan Russell.
Hello and welcome to Behind the Goals, episode 20, and the third of our masterclass series, which is a series of one-off episodes where we speak to a range of different experts around a different range of topics which we think will help community-owned sports clubs and community sports clubs at all levels of Scottish sport. This week, we're very lucky because we have a friend of mine from university, Erin Fulton, from Stirling, and who's now the intern and volunteer manager at PAS. So we're very lucky to have Erin here to talk about volunteering.
Yeah, everything you ever wanted to know about volunteering and much
more.
more.
And more, yeah. And her cake selection sounds particularly good. So we'll dive into the podcast now. So, Erin, thank you very much for joining us on the masterclass series.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you've joined us from PAS, which... Please do explain what PAS is.
Okay, so yeah, PAS is Scotland's leading people in place charity. We basically help get people involved in planning and placemaking. So we like town planning, urban design, things like that. It might not, be the sort of thing that people think, oh yeah, that's like where I'm going to have a say. But actually it affects everyone's lives. So, we all live in places, we all work in places, and we want to make sure that they have the right functions and services and also the right design to support us basically throughout our whole lives. So what PAS does is that they provide advice. So they have volunteers who are professional planners who you can get in touch with and say, oh, look, there's a development happening near me. Like, I want to put a comment in, or even I'm putting a shed up in my garden. Like, what are the planning conditions around that? And our professional planning volunteers will give them a bit of guidance on that so they can take their projects forward. But we also do like community engagement, and that's an increasing part of what we do. So we run workshops with the community to help basically shape the places that they live. So we'll sort of do a bit of a survey, sometimes use Place Standard, which you can look up online if you want to find out more about that. And that kind of asks about, the facilities and the amenities in your area. Do you feel safe? How's traffic and travel in your area? Do you feel like you've got influence and control over the decisions that are happening in your life? So we do a bit of a survey, and then we get ideas down on paper, and we usually write that up into a bit of a report for, say, the council or whoever our client kind of is at that time. Volunteers are a big part of what we do, and they support all those workshops. They're very knowledgeable, very experienced, and they, help facilitate those discussions so people get the most out of them, basically. So that's kind of what PAS does in a nutshell. It's very varied. And
you're the volunteers and intern manager at PAS?
Yes, I am. So we've got around about 400 volunteers. A lot of them are from like a built environment background, but actually increasingly we're looking to expand that because people have many different skills and experiences that they can bring to PAS and make our work even more effective. So we're broadening our range a little bit, and part of that is we've just launched a youth volunteer programme, so that's really exciting to sort of help support young people and feeling like they are empowered to shape the places that they live and that they can encourage their peers to do the same thing.
So the systems and the processes that people have to go through when they're thinking about developing the place where they live and trying to get a bit of agency over it, they're quite complex.
Exactly.
It must be a bit of an impenetrable field to get into when people are starting out.
So I think that's exactly why PAS came to be, basically, because it's, the planning system, semi-legal, it's quite confusing, and sometimes I think people think, I don't know about any of this, like I'm just not even going to bother getting involved, or if they do, they get themselves entangled and anxious. So PAS is basically to try and make that journey a bit easier and to make sure that everyone has the way to, the ability to have a say about the places that they live.
And if you are a community sports club listening to this, and you might instantly, automatically not recognise what your role is within what you're talking about there, but if you were a community sport club that was thinking about taking on an asset or developing a facility, or even just engaging more in the community, then they could potentially come to PAS for some advice. And these are all things that would affect a club, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So they could go onto the PAS website, which is just www.pas.org.uk. We've got an inquiries tab, and you can put the details of your inquiry down there, and that will get sent on to our advice service.
Excellent. So the reason we're speaking to you today is about volunteering.
Yeah, my speciality.
Which is your speciality, and something that we've been very keen to help support clubs with further, because it's such a crucial part of community sport across the UK, not only in Scotland. And even when I was doing a bit of research here, apparently there's 400,000 volunteers that help make up the kind of the sport landscape in the UK. So such a crucial part of I suppose not only numerous sort of community organisations, but massive for sports clubs themselves.
Yeah, absolutely, and it helps, make them happen, but also to make sure that because people are really passionate about these areas, and it's a way of them, being able to give back and get the most out of, their interests, and develop themselves as well. But, it's a massive health and well-being aspect as well, getting people involved with volunteering. It really strengthens communities, strengthens clubs, and it means that you will have a core of people whose heart are really in it. They're not doing it for any other reason.
Yeah.
They're doing it because they absolutely feel so passionate about the project that they're working on.
Absolutely.
One thing that I find quite interesting talking to people in those situations is they often don't even think of themselves as volunteers. So they're just getting involved. They're running the football club, or they're serving tea on a Saturday morning for their kids' games. If you actually said to them, called them a volunteer, they kind of raise their eyebrows and say, "Well, am I?"
Yeah, it's just part of who they are. It's part of what they do, and it's a big part of their values as well. So yeah, they might not have that distinguishing area.
So that, I suppose, leads in quite nicely to what is volunteering, if you were to sum it up in a couple of sentences.
So volunteering is sort of individuals giving their time of their own free will, not feeling obliged that they have to, and not doing it for any financial reward. Of course, a good volunteering policy would include, giving them back expenses and things like that. But yeah, it is entirely up to them. They're doing it because they really want to.
Mm-hmm. And just some of the different roles, even there you were talking about what kind of aspects of a club a volunteer might get involved in, but what kind of things might a volunteer engage with a club through?
Through all kinds of levels. It can be your very occasional roles, so that could be fundraising, so you're going down to your local supermarket to do a bag pack to raise funds, but right up to the administration of the club, so your board, the people who are really accountable, and where the buck stops for the actual running of the club. It's quite a responsibility that they take on in a voluntary capacity.
Absolutely.
And statutory requirements in a lot of cases for doing that kind of work.
Yeah.
So even a bit of research here from I think it was Sport England. Apparently 2.7 billion per annum in terms of volunteers' time, and we're going to talk about how you could measure volunteer value later on, aren't we? But I think that's probably just a interesting amount. That's such a huge contribution to Scottish sport, UK sport, through volunteers. So I suppose beyond that, why is volunteering important?
Well, it's important, to the individual. So as I mentioned, you've got your sort of health and well-being aspect. Studies have shown that, people really, sorry, I'm stumbling again. So what's the best way to structure this? Yeah, so you've got volunteers are important, on a national scale. So you've got services being provided by volunteers. They're important to communities because they create active citizens and people who are actively involved in their clubs and communities, and also improves health and well-being for that individual. So if you're a new organisation, having a volunteer network provides access to individuals that have skills and expertise and a real passion for their local community. So we've talked a little bit before about you're not paying the volunteers, but that's not the only benefit. You've got people who are really committed to the cause, and are there because they really, really want to do it, and they will do a good job. And also for the volunteer themselves, I've been a volunteer, expect you guys have volunteered as well in your own capacities, I talk about my volunteering more than I talk about my degree when I go into a job interview. Like, it's been an incredibly valuable experience for me. I've built lots of skills and knowledge and real practical case studies that I can talk about when I go into a job interview. So that's another benefit for, the relevance and the importance of volunteering.
So if you were a community sports club and you currently don't have anything in the way of a kind of volunteering program, you've maybe got like one coach or two coaches who are perhaps volunteers, how would you go about kind of creating something more formal, a bit more structured? What kind of tools would you need to make that a reality?
Yeah, so I guess you want to start thinking about the kind of the volunteer cycle, the volunteer journey, if you like, from kind of recruitment through to retention to, them actually, performing in their roles as well. So you might want to start thinking about, where could you use volunteers? Where, and there's probably more areas than you think. So there's stuff like, when I worked at Reserve previously, I had a volunteer administrator who helped me do volunteer hours and things like that. So when you really think about it, there might be opportunities that you haven't considered before. So there's stuff like that. So you kind of work that way. What do you need? What do you need from a volunteer? Drop a role profile. That should outline kind of like what they will be doing, why they're doing it, and what they'll get out of it as well. So those are quite key aspects to include in that. That also will serve the kind of basis for an advert, which you can put out on various websites. I'm sure there's sports websites that you can use to advertise that way. And there's also places like Volunteer Scotland, which will advertise your roles for you too. And all areas will have a kind of third sector interface. So in Edinburgh, we've got Volunteer Edinburgh. And so just look up your local one and they'll be able to advertise roles for you as well. From there on, you kind of want to make sure that you get the right person for the role. So invite them in for a chat if you get a response. Invite them in for a chat to find out more, to find out what they want from that role too. You want to make sure that it's a two-way process. The volunteer gets out as much of it as you do from them. So invite them in for a chat, make sure any questions that they have are answered, and that if you've got any questions for them, that they are able to answer them too. So once you've got that, that's kind of your basis for getting volunteers involved. It's also useful to take like a bit of an audit if you already have volunteers involved in your club, to think about how many have you got, what skills they've got, policies and procedures. So that's quite important to include for volunteers as well, so that it can be your health and safety, a sort of complaints or problem solving procedure too, because hopefully they won't come up, but you've got to always be prepared for if they do. And stuff like recognizing your volunteers too. So do you account for their hours? Do you make sure that you're recognizing them that way? Have you got like a long service system in place? It kind of just depends on where you are in your volunteer journey, if you like, from engaging volunteers. Training and development as well is really important. I think people think, they'll just turn up, and they'll just do their thing. But actually, even for the what seems like the smallest of roles, there's always a kind of training and development opportunity, even if it's just come in, sit down have a briefing before your fundraising activity. This is where we'll be. This is what we're going to do. It can be over the phone. It doesn't need to be a massive setup with spreadsheets and flip charts and icebreakers, but we all love that. But it doesn't need to be complicated. And it's a real good opportunity to get to know your volunteers as well. So, think about what you've already got set up in place. And any safeguarding strategies that you need to put in place as well for working with young members or even young volunteers, because they don't have to always be over 18. People 18 and under will get a lot out of volunteering too. So just make sure that everything's set up for them that way. So that's probably a good place to start, is a bit of an overview, a bit of an assessment of where you are with volunteering and your volunteering systems at the moment, and take it from there and think about, what do you need? Who do you need? Why do you need them?
So the bit that stuck out there for me was the two-way. It should be a two-way kind of street, which I think probably gets overlooked quite a lot, doesn't it?
It shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I think it makes for a really good quality experience if you think of it as a two-way thing. They're not just coming in to do free stuff for you, but likewise, while there's sort of like different opinions on this, make sure that they're coming in for a valuable experience. You probably will be able to find good, valuable, meaningful work for them to do. But if for some reason, or if you haven't got the capacity to support a person who wants to volunteer, there'll be other places who are looking for volunteers, and support them to find another placement. And that can be through, like we mentioned earlier, your local volunteering interface, or just keep them on your books. You know, just say, like, really sorry, but we haven't got something at the moment. But, you know, if you don't mind me keeping your name and your email address, then we can get in touch if something relevant comes up, or do feel free to give us a call in 6 months' time and we can let you know what we've got going on. It's important to support the volunteers, and in my role, I like to have quite a relationship based management strategy, which means that the volunteers know who I am. I'm very approachable. They can pick up the phone, they can say, Erin, did this thing today, like, wasn't that great, and here's why, and I'll listen, we'll have a chat about it, we'll work out a solution that way. It's all very friendly and approachable and easygoing. It's one of the reasons I got Twitters.
People can contact you.
Exactly.
Anytime.
People can contact me in different ways, but it is important to make sure that volunteers are properly supported, to make sure that they enjoy themselves, they have fun, and also if anything goes wrong, that you're available to support them through that. Does mean that somebody should be assigned to give them that support, and it takes a little bit of time and thought.
So the focus is all around it being enjoying, fulfilling, and not just being showing up to do free work.
Yeah, exactly. Volunteering is sort of changing over the years, and especially more recently, like, people have lots of different things to be spending their times on. They could be going to gigs, they could be watching their Netflix series. You know, why should they volunteer? It's an experience, you know, so it has to be a worthwhile experience, it has to be an enjoyable experience. Otherwise they're going to be like, no, sorry, I'm going to take up this Pilates class, you know. So yeah, you know, you have to make it worthwhile for them. But actually, if you do that, you have a really good all-round experience. You, as you know, as a volunteer manager yourself, will have a better experience. You'll feel like you're doing the best for them. You really will, because you will have to go the extra mile, because there's nothing, they're not staying there for anything, you know. So it has to be like, sort of, them knowing you builds that commitment, and also, you know, feeling that they're valued, that they're useful, and making it a good, rewarding experience for them will help everyone perform at their best, basically.
I think a lot, I mean, you're going a little bit off topic into broader issues here. I think in the modern world, a lot of things are disconnected, and everything you can do through an app, but actually, you know, doing something face to face, human interaction is often the bit that's missing for people. And yeah, I think of some of the studies that they do around, I think it's the Global Happiness Index. One of the things it measures is kind of connectedness, in the sense of being a part of something. And that seems to be, you know, one of the big places you can get that sense of connectedness is by doing this kind of stuff. Yeah,
and I guess that comes down to how you also support your volunteers. I think that feeling of being connected to a wider cause and a wider network, whether you emphasise that to them, to your volunteers, through communications, like at PAS we've got Volunteer Direct, we've got a newsletter. In my role at Girl Guiding, we've got our Facebook page. So just helping them feel, because sometimes volunteer roles are not, they can be quite solitary, they can even be virtual, which is great, but having that connection and that, just like phoning them up and being like, just checking in on you, just make sure you're getting on okay, if you've got any questions or queries, like, I'm here to answer them for you. Like, yeah, it makes it a much more enjoyable experience, and they don't feel neglected.
Yeah.
So one thing that you said there, which I guess worth picking up on, is about, you know, if you don't do the program properly and you don't kind of commit proper resources to it, or have somebody there dedicated to help that person, probably your retention level is pretty low. So if you actually invest in it and you make it worthwhile, you're going to have better volunteers, happier volunteers, your retention rate will be higher.
Yeah, exactly. Retention levels will be much more improved.
So then you don't have to go out and find another 5 volunteers in a year's time.
But it's an interesting point you make on retention. If anyone cares to read it, there's a good report on volunteering called the New Alchemy Report, which I kind of picked up on via Shelter Scotland through an interesting talk they had. And through that kind of meeting I had with other volunteer managers, we talked a little bit about retention. One, do be prepared for your volunteers to leave. Like, life changes. People have babies, people move, they get other interests. So be prepared for them to leave, and to make sure that they're thanked for their involvement. Sure. That they feel that their time has been valued. They might come back. Volunteers will leave. It's change days. People will not stay in them for massive lengths of time. But a good way of retaining volunteers is by that sense of connection, basically, and that kind of sense of loyalty to the club or to the manager, to their friends who are probably also doing it. That's a big keeper.
And when you have got somebody that's interested and you've got to the stage where they're about to start, what do you need to have anything formal in place in terms of nothing presumably as formal as a contract, but some sort of terms of reference for each other in terms of what you can expect from one another? So
that's an excellent thing to have on, to just make sure that everyone understands their expectations quite explicitly from both sides. A lot of places have a volunteer handbook. At PAS, we're just sort of revamping ours, so it makes it look like a nice, attractive piece that we give to volunteers when they start volunteering. Nice and colourful. It sort of outlines our expectations of them and their expectations of us as well, and what they should expect, or what procedures they can go through if things are not quite right. But also how we will support them, and kind of their expectations with regards to expenses and stuff like that. So that can be in a volunteer handbook. Within our volunteer handbook at PAS, we also have a volunteer agreement. So obviously volunteers are not obliged to be there for any length of time. They're volunteers, they can exit at any point. But the volunteer agreement usually just says something like, ours at the moment I think says, I will agree, I'm signing to agree by the terms and conditions as outlined in the volunteer handbook. And that's basically like, when you're out and about as a volunteer, you're representing PAS, so we expect you to be respectful and be impartial. We have our PAS values outlined there. So if a club has their values, then that's the place that they want to put them. And they might want to have a chat with a manager or whoever about what that kind of means in context of the volunteer role, because sometimes I think they can seem a bit scary, but they really do help create a sense of cohesiveness and a shared goal when you are working for or volunteering for a club. So that's all it is, and it's just really like low level stuff. Like, if you're not going to be able to make a volunteering opportunity, do let us know as far in advance as possible. Be respectful, be impartial. You are representing the organisation when you're out and about, basically.
What should organisations have in mind about what they need to provide in order to ensure a safe working place, or a safe volunteering place for people coming along? It strikes me that you mentioned protection of vulnerable groups earlier. I'm thinking of things like insurance. Are there other things that they need to have in place that they might not have thought of?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Insurance will be something that you'll need to cover, and it's worth sort of checking with your current insurance policy about whether they would cover any harm or damage that would occur to volunteers while they were volunteering for you, which hopefully would not happen. But it's important that you have that. We've mentioned sort of PBG and disclosure schemes for working with children, young people and vulnerable groups. So that's something that's would be quite high up there. Also, if you're working with younger people, I would encourage people to do like a safeguarding training, look into organising that, just to make sure that everyone sort of understands how to create a safe space, so people are not tripping over wires or hurting each other, or even like how to protect yourselves, or what to do if you were to hear disclosure in a more serious context, if a young person were to tell you something that made you concerned for their well-being. So you want to have the procedure set up to manage that sort of thing. It sounds a little scary, but there's a lot of information out there about it, and it's just make sure that you've got your backs covered and everyone understands what's expected of them. Risk assessments, that's also something worth having. They shouldn't take very long, they shouldn't be very complicated, but it does help you walk through like what you're going to be doing. So you're going to be down at the supermarket doing a bag pack, like what do you need to look out for? The members of the public there, will you be getting under their feet? Will there be people under the age of 18 there? Do they need to be supervised? Do you need parental consent forms? It helps you walk through it all and think about what is the risk? What do I need to do to mitigate that risk? It shouldn't take very long. And it also is a good thing to share with everyone else so they know what to do.
Yeah.
So, that's an excellent point to make sure that you've kind of got those, that infrastructure in place.
Okay. So, for clubs that have got big volunteer setups and perhaps want to demonstrate their value in terms of what they're doing within the community, in terms of offering opportunities to young people, in terms of giving them experience and giving them skills, how would you best recommend that organisations and clubs could sort of measure that kind of value of volunteers?
Well, just collecting data, I guess, is one of the best ways of kind of measuring that impact. You can do that in different ways. So at PAS, we've just started collecting our volunteer hours, because actually we get funding from various places, and to have that amounted in hours, be like, volunteers contributed X amount of hours over this past year, and usually it's huge, really strikes a chord with people who are trying to support you financially, but also like the volunteers like to see that too. They're like, oh yeah, like we did give a lot, that does feel good. So that's one way that you can do it. Another way is what we have done before is just kind of like measure and record their engagement. So Simon volunteered at a community workshop on this day, also engaged at a training on another day. It's important that you also record their training that you provide them, because it's something that they are doing to enhance their volunteer role. Another way you can do it, if you have the means, is to kind of translate those hours into costs, which is also a nice attractive way of framing it. And you can do that, you can choose your line. I suppose you could do minimum wage, or sometimes if it's a skilled role, there'll be different baselines for that, but that can also really demonstrate the impact that volunteers are having within the club or the organisation. So I think those are the main ways of doing it. For the volunteers' perspective as well, some organisations offer a long service award, so usually for like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Bit of a badge. Some volunteers hate it, find terribly embarrassing, but other volunteers really appreciate the recognition. I got my 5-year service for volunteering with guiding when I was a few years ago now, but I just remember feeling like, oh, this is so nice, like I have my little badge that I can put on, and people are like, oh, you volunteered for 5 years for Girl Guide, and I feel like, yeah, I did, I've really given back. So that's quite a nice way of recognising the volunteers and measure their value in that way. I'm sure there's many other ways to do it. I guess it just kind of depends on what you can record and and what works for your systems, I suppose, and the nature of the volunteering that they're given, because you can't measure a volunteer's impact an hour, really. An advice service volunteer for PAS could give 30 minutes of advice, but actually really make a big impact to that individual's life. But we do want to try, even in some ways, to quantify how the volunteers are having an impact, because they really do, and it's really important that we share that with other people in a frame that they understand.
One powerful thing I've seen some organisations do is find opportunities to tell the story of why somebody began volunteering, what it meant to them, how it's changed them, and also how it's changed the lives of the people that they've touched. And that's really, really powerful. It's very motivating for the volunteer, but also for the rest of the organisation. A little reminder that this is the difference that they're all making on a daily basis. And you're just choosing one person to talk about because they've hit 5 years or 1,000 hours or whatever it is. But that's a good motivating force for the whole organisation.
Yeah, so if you've got the capacity for that kind of like communication, like for example at PAS, we've just got a kind of in focus blog that we've launched, and that's when one of our volunteers will actually interview another volunteer and ask them about their previous experiences with PAS and why did they get involved, what motivates them to do this, and that will be shared with other volunteers, and that will in turn create this sense of connectivity and make them feel like they're part of this bigger network and be like, well, yeah, like we do quite cool stuff. And I guess that's the nice thing about storytelling and communications, that it forces you to step back. Sometimes you're a bit like, oh no, like I have to do this blog, I've not really got time for it. But actually when you do it, you're like, oh yeah, we do good stuff, and our volunteers do excellent work, and it helps you reflect and, like you said, Alan, share with other people the amazing work that the volunteers contribute.
And actually in the volunteering guidance that we put out, there was a list of all the clubs, and they've used the kind of measurement of hours versus the non-London living wage. And they kind of showed the amount of hours and how much that would equate to in terms of the people involved in making their club a success. And there was some research as well in terms of, you know, those community-owned clubs, how much volunteering is worth to those clubs in terms of making them actually financially viable, you know. So that, you know, as you say, Erin, you can sort of pick and choose, can't you, which way suits you best.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we asked you if you could pull some top tips together if you were a community club.
Was this a quiz?
This isn't a quiz. It's Erin's.
Oh no, it's not quiz.
Curated top 8 tips for a community sports club. What are the kind of 8 things that a sports club should think about when they've got a volunteering program?
Yeah, we're saying 8 because I couldn't think of
10. But it was going to be 10. But
it's very holistic. You don't want to force it, and that's the thing is that there's not any wrong way to. Well, there are some wrong ways to do things, but by and large, a lot of it is about, you know, getting a feel for what the volunteers want and getting to know them and what they want to get out of their experience. So I came up with my 8 top tips.
Let's have number 1 then.
That I would go for. So we've got promote your volunteer opportunities. So you might be surprised where you can find support. So stuff like I mentioned, your sort of third sector interface, Volunteer Scotland, they've got an advertisement space on their website. I've advertised for volunteers via Gumtree,
right,
and got volunteers via Gumtree. So that might be a venue for you, but also like talk about it to people and be like, oh, what are you up to? And like, oh yeah, we're just looking for a new coach at the moment, and actually they might be like, oh yeah, my neighbour did coaching, like you said you'd quite like to get into it. So that's a really good way
word of mouth.
Exactly, and that's how I got involved with leading a brownie unit.
Right.
Because somebody I actually overheard a conversation, this is me eavesdrop, and they were like, oh yeah, the leader's going to leave, we might need to shut the unit, and I was like, I'll do it. 2 years later. It was a very rewarding experience.
You just had to caveat that though, didn't you?
Yeah. So yeah, promote your volunteer opportunity, and you can do it quite creatively. It doesn't need to be your standard poster on the wall, although definitely do that.
What's the most creative you've had so far then?
Oh, I saw a really good cheesy video once on YouTube trying to get volunteers to, I think it was like pulling this weed on a reserve, and they did this really hilarious, this is an RSPB one, video that they were sort of like selling it as a kind of like a day out, like a really fun experience, you know, good workout, a good way to like network with other members of the community. It was just good fun, and it was not like high production either. It was just somebody on their phone, and it was funny, I suppose, and that's what made it attractive to people, and I think that was quite successful for them. Move on to number 2.
Yeah, number 2, please. Yeah.
What did I put for number 2?
This you should have. According to my notes, Erin, you said take the time to get to know your volunteers.
Yes, that was it. That's a very important one. As I mentioned before, I like to take a sort of relationship-based management approach, and that means when a volunteer first sends me their registration form, I always schedule in time for a chat. The other people in the office must be sick to death of me being like, so how did you hear about PAS? And let me introduce myself. But I do like to sort of just chat with them. It's not an interrogation. It's just a, hiya, I'm Erin, this is PAS. Why do you want to volunteer? Like, what's your background? What's your interest? Where do you want to develop skills? Have that conversation, and just that's the first opportunity I have to be like, this is, you know, a two-way dialogue. I'm an approachable person. This is very much for you as much as it is for PAS. And continue that dialogue where possible. With a volunteer base as big as PAS, it's not possible for me to have, you know, one-to-ones every, you know, few months with volunteers to check on how they're doing. But I do make the most and try to go along to as many of the training opportunities as possible. We put on around 25 training opportunities for volunteers throughout the year. And I also do stuff like the Volunteer Direct, which is our sort of newsletter that we send out to volunteers with news and volunteer opportunities. And I always reply to those emails and pick up the phone if I can as well, and see them in person if they're in town or I'm near where they are. And that helps you keep the finger on the pulse with what the volunteers, how they're getting on, and if you think, oh, maybe so and so's not feeling so settled, and what can I do to support them throughout that. So it's a little bit time consuming, but I actually don't mind it. It's like the favourite part of my job. I love speaking to the volunteers. I think they do great stuff, and I just amazed at their dedication. So don't worry about that. It'll make it feel, it's incredibly rewarding to take the time to get to know the volunteers, even if it's just a one-off thing. Go along, say hi, thank them in person for what they're doing.
Yeah. So you talked about having a kind of a key point of contact with volunteers. What type? So you're quite you're a very friendly, approachable person. Bubbly. And I wonder what type of characteristics is that, that's what you would want to have in a kind of key point of contact for a volunteer manager.
Yeah, I mean, people are all different, and I wouldn't expect everyone to take the same approach as me. It is what feels natural to me and my kind of personality. Not everyone is, but people respond to different managers in different ways. So I think as long as you're accessible, and somebody who is interested in people and genuinely wants to do the best for them, that's the kind of person you want, looking after the volunteers. PAS are quite lucky. They've got the means to have a dedicated role, full-time role, just looking after their volunteers. Totally appreciate that's not the scenario everywhere. But, volunteers can manage volunteers. In my Girl Guiding role at the moment, we have a peer education programme. I'm the coordinator for Scotland. It's quite virtual. I do a lot of it over email and Facebook and over the phone. But, I still like to make sure that they can contact me. So, it doesn't have to be a staff member if they haven't got time. It can be it can be another one of these volunteer roles that you think, oh, this is a good opportunity. And actually, it's an amazing opportunity to get management skills, to develop people skills. There's lots of information out there for people who are interested, lots of training. Volunteer Scotland's a good place to go for further training if you think you've identified somebody who would be really good for it and just needs a bit of, development, a bit of focus.
Sure. Okay. Well, we'll include the website to that in the...
Yeah, definitely. They're excellent.
Okay, number 3.
Make time for training and orientation. So I've talked about that before. There's always ways that you can develop your volunteers and upskill them, and it's one of the ways that you can give back to your volunteers as well. So make sure that the experience is worthwhile for them. At PAS, we've recently started sort of recognising that with a little certificate, which means that they can show employers that this is a training that they went on to. You'd have to identify what's useful and valuable for your volunteers. It might be a one-off thing. It might be this is just relevant for one volunteer to go on this training, in which case, you might find an external provider to do that. Or it might be that actually we have people who already volunteer or work for us who are quite knowledgeable about this area, so they can facilitate the training. And trainings are a lot of fun to do. Another fun aspect of my job, which I really like doing, is doing the volunteer welcomes. And volunteer welcomes are an excellent, some people call them inductions, but because of PAS, we've got quite a high sign up of volunteers. Every few months I'll just have a bit of a gathering with the new volunteers and some old ones as well if possible, just to give them that sort of introduction, like, this is PAS, this is where you could get involved, these are projects that we've been working on, stuff like that, and show that you're interested in them. Definitely make time for that.
Okay.
It's a good way to get to know them.
Yeah, that does sound like a good kind of icebreaker, certainly. Number 4.
Relationship-based management approach, which is a very, very snappy...
This is your word of the day.
Words of the day. I actually picked it up from, and they've got a good blog on it, Shelter Scotland, I'll send it to you afterwards, about their kind of management approach. And I thought, that's very much me. That's very much what works for me. But also, like we talked about, building the relationship with people. They like that face-to-face interaction. It's one of the things that people feel that they're really lacking perhaps in this 21st century world that they're looking out for in a volunteering role. So and that kind of means, like I've said before, picking up the phone, going to their training, saying hello, making networking opportunities, just time to hang out if they like. So yeah, that's an approach that I would highly recommend. It might not be for everyone, but I think your volunteers would really appreciate it. It's an opportunity for you to show them that you think they are important and they are valued. because you've made the effort to speak to them.
Sure. Okay. Number 5.
I think that was be creative. I gave up with the numbers and just went for bullet points.
Switch to lettering. Point E.
Bullet point 5.
Point five, be creative. So I think maybe, volunteering's had a bit of like an outdated image, and they think that it's for retired people and charity shops, which definitely has its place. And I love a charity shop, I love those volunteers who, help run them. But there's, real opportunities to get creative with volunteering and creative with the opportunities that you offer. I was thinking, I could really do a hand with the Volunteer Direct. That's our newsletter. Like, I'm not really in the way of editing stuff, or like haven't necessarily got the time to write things as fun and engaging as I would like. So I got a volunteer for it, and she wants to be an editor, so she's thinking this is a great opportunity for her.
Yeah.
I chat to her like every week or so, and it's going really well. And also be creative with your kind of promotion, as we already mentioned, and be creative with your training, and make sure that it's a fun, enjoyable experience for everyone.
I like that. That's good. Mm-hmm. So there's little roles that quite time consuming, but you think somebody else would value the opportunity to lead on it. I think every organisation can think of roles like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, blob 6 on your paper there.
Dot 6. Good communications. So at PAS we have a newsletter which we send out every 2 weeks to our volunteers. We've also got my Twitter, and this, helps them
which
feel
you're very active on.
I am semi-active on my Twitter.
Okay.
I post every couple of times a week.
Trump.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I haven't got that much interesting stuff or the opportunity to take pictures going on day to day, but I am fairly active on Twitter. But yeah, that like helps make you available to the volunteers, and also helps them keep up to date with stuff that's going on in the club or the organisation, and will mean that they feel informed, that they feel part of any changes, that they are connected. And I think that's one of, if I'm going to take away anything, I think, from this podcast, is making sure people feel connected to the club and the cause.
Okay, I like that. So just ways that you can get everyone to feel a kind of shared sense of belonging.
Yeah, shared identity as well, especially with a club.
Yeah, okay. 7.
I think it was have fun. Yeah, we'll go for have fun.
Have fun.
Number 7 is have fun. If you're having fun as a manager, then the volunteers will hopefully be having fun as well. And hopefully via the areas that I just mentioned, being creative, having fun. We talked about volunteering being an experience for people, something that they are not doing time that they're not doing other things in, that they're not, doing sport, that they're not necessarily, watching the Netflix series that they want to, catching up on latest Stranger Things, Orange is the New Black. There's so much. To quote Sheldon, we're in the golden age of television. So there's a lot to take them away from volunteering. So you have to make it a fun, valuable experience. And it doesn't need to be a chore. I think that's what makes my job so enjoyable, is I'm always thinking, why would a volunteer do this? What would make them enjoy doing this? So have fun. Think about that all the time.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good one as well, because I suppose the whole thing of this is really about how to get, resource for clubs and actually help upskill people that are wanting to help as well. But you see so many clubs folding now because there's a lack of volunteers, and it's probably because there's so much work involved. And actually, what you're spot on about, it should be fun.
Yeah,
you need to.
And I think it's the big thing that makes it not feel like work.
Yeah.
Because the way you talk about volunteering is, it doesn't sound like a job at all, in a good way.
Exactly. Yeah. So absolutely have fun and take the time to reflect. And I guess this moves on to my final point, is celebrate. So, it's a shame when volunteering starts to feel like a chore. But if you take the time to kind of step back and write the blog about an awesome volunteer, or have the volunteer celebration event where you have a bit of a barbecue maybe, and celebrate the season, then, make the time for that, because it really does put it all in perspective, and it just brings home like how amazing and important it is at the work that they're doing. So factor that into all volunteer experiences. Include staff, absolutely include staff if you've got staff. Make it a whole team thing.
Yeah. That's great. So what other type of support is available? You've listed quite a lot of organisations there, but what kind of type of support, if I was a club looking for a bit of advice, a bit of guidance, what would be my go-to organisations?
So your go-to organisations, I would highly recommend Volunteer Scotland. They kind of manage volunteering throughout the whole of Scotland. They also do their Investing in Volunteers award. They've got loads of training. They've got guidance on their website on how to involve volunteers, how to manage challenging volunteer situations, how to celebrate your volunteers and make them feel valued. They've got heaps of information on their website, so I'd highly recommend going to Volunteer Scotland. They're great guys, really friendly, really approachable, very easy to use guidance.
Is it volunteerscotland.org?
Sure, why
right,
not?
we'll check it out. Take that out in the edit. Sure, why not? Just Google it. Everybody should just Google it.
Just Google Volunteer Scotland. Look for the third sector interface in your area. For example, in Edinburgh, we've got Volunteer Edinburgh. I think in Perth and Kinross, you've got Perth and Kinross Voluntary Action Service. There will be one that kind of helps manage volunteering and also charitable organisations, so they can probably help you with other aspects of running a club too, like finances and things like that. A couple other things worth mentioning, if you're really interested in volunteer management, there's a guy called Rob Jackson Consulting. He's got a blog on volunteering. He's the go-to guy who kind of writes loads of books on volunteer management, and is where you can get really up-to-date volunteer management guidance. And I've mentioned the new Alchemy report by NFP Synergy, if anyone can remember that, but that's a real good overview of the volunteering status in the UK and how the sort of face of volunteering is changing and how that changes how we manage volunteers going forward.
Well, we'll make sure we put links to all of them in the...
Absolutely. These are really helpful resources for people.
Yeah. And you did mention them, but Sport Scotland do have a kind of a volunteering thing as well. So if you are looking for a volunteer, you can go and post up on their website as well, which is very helpful. And where can people follow you, Erin, if they want to?
So if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, I sometimes post pictures of the work I'm doing or any workshops I'm running or cakes that I've baked for the office, which might be the real draw, perhaps.
Yeah, vegan-friendly cakes the other day.
Very vegan, award-winning vegan-friendly cakes.
Award-winning.
I may have won Best Baker for the office if I haven't told the whole world yet. And that's on Twitter at Paz_Erin, ERIN.
Well, thank you so much for coming by to our office and chatting to us and giving us a masterclass on volunteering.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys.
Okay, so that was Erin Fulton from Paz. Really interesting discussion there. Big takeaways for me, Andrew, were just the sense of fun and enjoyment that Erin gets from doing what she does. And I think that there's a thread that should really run through volunteering for any organisation and make it distinctive and different than just doing work and not being paid for it.
Yeah, very much so. And I guess, as she says, not every organisation is going to be in a position where they can have a volunteer manager. But if you do have somebody that's kind of designated to be in that role to look after your volunteers, especially if you've got a big coaching setup or a big club that has lots of activities, you're going to be very reliant on volunteers. But even if you just have somebody that's kind of approachable and friendly and I suppose likeable.
Yeah, I mean that sense of enjoyment and making it lighthearted as well as looking after things and doing things really, really well. It's not something that costs anything. So regardless of what resources you have, there's always that. There should always be that ability to make it fun and make it enjoyable for people. And
some interesting things there about how you kind of, I suppose, measure volunteers in terms of the impact, but then B, also celebrate them as well. So having. Yeah. Actually counting out the hours that they're doing and kind of coming up with a number in terms of the sort of economic impact, but then also, whether you do something for them at the end of the year or
that's right.
So awards. So
yeah, that kind of recognition is probably much more valuable than any reward you could give people for doing it. I think the other thing I took away from the conversation is that there's a lot that you have to be careful about, and you have to be sensitive to in terms of statutory requirements, legal requirements, but that shouldn't stop you from doing it, because you can still have that impact that you want to have if you cover those basics really effectively. And the good news is that there's lots and lots of support there for people who want to know what they need to cover, what the requirements are for, safeguarding or PVG or insurance or any of the other sort of boring but important stuff. You don't have to invent this stuff or think it out for yourself. People have covered this already, and there's lots and lots of help there and support there for people to get that help.
And retention's such a big thing that actually if you spend a good amount of time with it at the start before you get it all set up and you have a proper system, then it's worthwhile in the long term, isn't it? So make sure all those links are in the notes at the bottom, and all those organisations, and do go and follow Erin on Twitter and
find out about the cakes
and all the other organisations on that list. Okay, until next week.
We'll speak to you next week.
Behind the Goals is a Supporters Direct Scotland podcast. You can get in touch with the show by emailing behindthegoals@hotmail.com, or you can also tweet the show at SupDirectScot. That's SUPP Direct Scot.